He was one of the most feared Irishmen in the mob. Involved in union racketeering, violence, and murder. He was a close friend of Jimmy Hoffa and aided in the most shocking assassination of the 20th century. This is the story of Frank the Irishman Sheeran. Frank Sheeran was born in Darby, Pennsylvania on the 25th of October 1920 to Irish Catholic parents. Shiran stayed clear of any trouble in his youth and had a quiet, unassuming childhood. He enlisted in the army during World War II and served in the invasion of Sicily, stationed in Catania, a small detail that would help him in the future. He was discharged from the army a day before his 25th birthday, on October 24, 1945. He returned home and took small jobs, usually as a truck driver or as a security guard in local bars and union halls. It was around this time period he met Russell Bufalino, head of the Bufalino crime family. One day, Shiran was having engine troubles on his truck and pulled into a pit stop where Bufalino happened to be. Bufalino saw the imposing young Irishman and walked over to help. Shiran later said of Bufalino that he was as close to Marlon Brando's portrayal of the Godfather as could be. He described him as very polite and soft-spoken. Bufalino was impressed with Shiran, partly because of the fact that Shiran had served in the same part of Sicily that he was born, Catania. He would refer to Shiran as Cheech, short for Frank in Italian. Their relationship blossomed, and it was shortly after that Shiran was introduced to a close friend of Bufalino's named Angelo Bruno, who was a prominent member of the Philadelphia mob. Bruno would rise to the head of the Philadelphia mob in 1959, taking over from Joe Ida. During this period, Shiran was asked to help with small errands, such as collecting loans and delivering messages. But it wasn't until an incident occurred with a man by the name of Whispers that Shiran was asked to commit murder. Whispers loaned a laundrette business a significant amount of money, but the laundrette owner was having problems in repaying the debt because of another rival competitor called Cadillac that was taking a majority of the trade. So Whispers asked Frank to sabotage Cadillac and to put it out of business for good. He asked Shiran to keep this strictly to himself and not to use anyone else for the job. Shiran agreed, and the next few days he scoped out Cadillac. Before Shiran carried out the job, he was summoned by the bosses to a local bar called the Friendly Lounge, run by Philadelphia mobster Skinny Razor DiTullio. Shiran knew he was in big trouble. He'd seen the Senate hearings on organized crime with Italian mafia members being called to testify, and he knew these men weren't to be trifled with. He explained the situation to Bufalino and Bruno. Bruno then explained to him that he owned a piece of Cadillac. Shiran then told Bruno that Whispers had told him to do it and to keep it a secret. They decided to give Shiran a pass, and Bruno told Shiran to fix it. The next day, Whispers was found shot to death on the sidewalk. Shiran and Bufalino's relationship continued to blossom, especially after Shiran helped introduce Bufalino to a lawyer that helped him fight a deportation case that he was facing. Thanks to Shiran's help, Bufalino beat the deportation case. Shiran was then introduced to Jimmy Hoffa over the phone. The first words Hoffa said to Shiran were, "I heard you paint houses," a euphemism for killing people. Shiran said he did, and also said he did his own carpentry work too, another euphemism for disposing of bodies. Hoffa took a liking to Shiran, and from that day on, Shiran would be a close friend and bodyguard to Hoffa. Sheeran would help Hoffa run local unions and resolve union disputes, usually by the use of force. Robert Kennedy was a thorn in the side of organized crime. As Attorney General, he'd been conducting investigations on the mafia. He took particular interest in the activities of Jimmy Hoffa. Hoffa was outraged with the investigations. Other mobsters such as Carlos Marcello, Santo Trafficante, and Sam Giancana were also targeted. A plan was hatched to kill Robert F. Kennedy's brother, President John F. Kennedy. The mob decided that if they killed the president, that Robert F. Kennedy would lose his power and would stop all investigations into mob activities. Shiran, on Bufalino's orders, was responsible for ensuring the weapons to be used in the plot were loaded onto a plane bound for Texas from Baltimore, a few days prior to the president's visit to Dallas. On November 22, 1963, President John F. Kennedy was shot and killed in Dallas, Texas. In 1967, Jimmy Hoffa was sent to prison for bribery and fraud. Sheeran spent most of his time running certain unions and maintaining order for Hoffa. During Hoffa's imprisonment in 1972, Sheeran was called upon by Bufalino to take care of a matter in New York. Crazy Joe Gallo was a dangerous gangster and member of a rebellious faction of the Colombo family. After being released from prison, he organized the murder of the head of the Colombo family, Joe Colombo. Mob bosses weren't happy with Colombo's activities. He'd been the head of the anti-Italian American Defense League, giving public speeches and conducting interviews with the press. It was too much publicity for a mob boss. The mob bosses decided to eliminate Colombo. Although the hit took place, the execution had been sloppy, as it was done in plain sight and in front of Colombo's family at an Italian Unity Day rally. A no-no in the rules of La Cosa Nostra. Colombo loyalists looked to seek revenge for the killing, and Gallo laid low after the hit. However, on the night of his birthday in 1972, Gallo celebrated with friends and a bodyguard. He was spotted at the Copa Cabana club in Manhattan. It was rumored that he was later lured to Umberto's Clam House, a late-night restaurant at the corner of Mulberry and Hester Street in Little Italy. Gallo sat with his back to the wall in the restaurant and after a few drinks relaxed his guard. It was then that Sheeran walked in and took position at the bar facing Gallo. After a few minutes, Sheeran stood up from the bar, walked over to Gallo's table, and started firing. Gallo's bodyguard, Pete the Greek Diapolis, was injured as Gallo ran for the exit, attempting to draw fire away from the group. Sheeran caught up to him outside and emptied more shots into Gallo. It was the end of Crazy Joe Gallo. Sheeran took off with an associate called John Francis, who drove the car to and from the hit. Conflicting accounts of the Gallo murder implicated 4 Colombo crime family members who stormed Umberto's and carried out the assassination under the orders of acting Colombo boss, Joseph Joey Yak Iacovelli. During his prison time, Hoffa had a falling out with a close ally named Tony Pro Provenzano, a captain in the Genovese family. The falling out was over pension payments for a union job that Provenzano thought he was entitled to, but Hoffa refused to honor the payments because of Provenzano's conviction. A physical altercation was said to have happened in prison where Hoffa had smashed a bottle over Provenzano's head. On December 23rd, President Nixon pardoned Hoffa after a payoff from the mob. Now a free man, Hoffa went on the campaign trail to get his position as head of the Teamsters back. However, Frank Fitzsimmons, Tony Pro, and the other mob bosses were against the idea. They wanted Hoffa to take the money and retire. Hoffa had other plans. Hoffa wanted to kill both Provenzano and Fitzsimmons to clear the path to winning the Teamsters presidency, but eventually decided against it. Concerned about the situation, Bufalino and Sheeran went to New York to meet the underboss of the Genovese family, Anthony "Fat Tony" Salerno. Salerno had control over a vast number of unions. He said he would support Hoffa's presidential campaign, but also wouldn't get in Tony Pro's way. After other setbacks in Hoffa's campaign and threats from the Fitzsimmons camp, Hoffa began publicly accusing the mob of involvement in the Teamsters pension fund. He claimed that under Fitzsimmons, loans given to the mob from the pension fund to buy Las Vegas casinos weren't being paid back. He said that once he was back in office, he would forfeit the loans and take over the casinos. By 1975, Hoffa's relationship with the mob had gone from bad to worse. Bufalino and fellow bosses had decided that Hoffa running for the 1976 election wasn't a good idea and conveyed this to Hoffa in a meeting. Hoffa simply ignored Bufalino's request. Bufalino replied saying that he, Hoffa, was not showing his appreciation for Dallas, in which he meant the assassination of Kennedy. After the meeting, Bufalino asked Shiran to try and convince Hoffa from running. He explained that people were having a serious problem with Jimmy. Bufalino said that if he can take out the President of the United States, they can take out the President of the Teamsters. On June 19, 1975, longtime ally and friend of Hoffa, Sam Giancana, boss of the Chicago outfit in the 1960s, was killed at his home in Chicago. He was subpoenaed to appear before a Senate committee on the plot to kill Cuban President Fidel Castro. The bosses were worried that Giancana would spill the beans and decided to eliminate him. Hoffa agreed to meet and straighten things out with Provenzano. He needed to get Tony Pro and the rest of the mob back on side if he was to have any chance of winning the 1976 election, and more importantly, surviving. A meeting was set up on July 30th, 1975 in Detroit, where Hoffa was due to meet Provenzano and Tony Giacolone. A few days prior to the meeting, Bufalino broke the news to Sheeran that Hoffa had to be eliminated and that he would need to take care of the matter. Sheeran figured that the job would go ahead with or without him, and if he refused, he would also be murdered. He had no choice. Before the designated meeting time, Sheeran drove to a house in Detroit where the hit would take place. A member of Tony Pro's crew, Sally Bugs Briguglio, was there to greet him. The Andretta brothers, presumed to be part of Tony Pro's crew, were there for the cleanup and body disposal operation. Chucky O'Brien Jr., Hoffa's adopted son, picked up Sheeran and Briguglio from the house and drove to the Matches Red Fox restaurant a short drive away. They picked up Hoffa, who was by now steaming. He'd been waiting for half an hour at the restaurant. He was reluctant to get in the car, but knew that his trusted friend Shiran was by his side, so he got in. They then drove to the house. Briguglio and Chucky Jr. dropped off Shiran and Hoffa, then drove away. Hoffa walked a few steps ahead of Shiran. When they entered the house, Hoffa didn't see anyone. It was a setup. As Hoffa turned and made his way to the door, Shiran pumped 2 shots into his friend's head. It was the end of Jimmy Hoffa. It was claimed that the body was taken to a nearby crematorium run by an associate and burnt. A few days after the disappearance, Shiran and Bufalino went to New York to meet Fat Tony Salerno for a post-Hoffa meeting to tie up any possible loose ends from the murder. Tony Pro was also at the meeting. Provenzano claimed that Shiran knew about Hoffa wanting to hit him and Fitzsimmons. Bufalino had a quiet word with Salerno and the beef was quashed. Provenzano was told to back down. A few days after the disappearance, Shiran was visiting his ex-wife Mary to drop off money. His daughter Peggy was there. She could see the look on Shiran's face. She knew that her father was involved in Hoffa's disappearance. It was the last day Shiran would see his daughter. In 1978, the mob had suspicions that Sally Bugs was cooperating with the FBI. Normal protocol would be that if a mob guy was to go into the FBI headquarters for whatever reason, that he had to inform their captain before they did. Sally Bugs had visited FBI headquarters without informing any of his superiors. He was now marked for death. Shiran and his friend, the redhead John Francis, were watching Briguglio as he was walking by Umberto's Clam House on Mulberry Street, the same Umberto's where Shiran had allegedly hit Joe Gallo 6 years earlier. Shiran and Francis approached Briguglio. Shiran greeted him and then pumped 2 bullets in his head. Francis pumped 3 more shots into him. It was the end of Sally Bugs. In 1980, Shiran was acquitted on murder charges, but a year later he was found guilty of a series of offenses and was sent to the Federal Correctional Institution Sandstone in Minnesota and remained there for the rest of the 1980s. In the early 1990s, he was moved to the Federal Institution of Springfield, Missouri, where he was reunited with his longtime friend and mentor, Russell Bufalino. Anthony Fat Tony Salerno was also there serving life imprisonment for racketeering. In 1991, Shiran was released on early parole on the grounds of poor health. In 1995, he was sentenced to 10 months in prison for parole violation after having a drink with Philadelphia boss John Stanfa. On October 10, 1995, Shiran, sick and frail, was released from prison. Time was running out for the old Irishman. He would spend his remaining years in care, recording his memoirs with the help of his lawyer, Charles Brandt. Brandt's records would later be turned into the book, I Heard You Paint Houses, and a movie called The Irishman, directed by Martin Scorsese. On December 14, 2003, on the same day the U.S. Armed Forces captured Iraqi leader Saddam Hussein, Frank The Irishman Sheeran died peacefully in a nursing home. He was 83 years old. For a man who'd seen and dealt so much violence in his life, it was a surprise to many that Frank Sheeran would live to the age of which he did. Many of his friends said of Shiran that he was a stand-up guy. Over many decades, Shiran declined law enforcement's offers of becoming a government informant in exchange for his freedom. In mob circles, he was often showed as much respect as fully fledged made members of La Cosa Nostra, a privilege he would never have because of his Irish heritage. Above all, however, Shiran would leave us with the legacy of being involved in one of the most gripping crime stories of the 20th century, the disappearance of Jimmy Hoffa.